Hello and welcome. My name is Rob Potash with CSMI, and you are tuned into Isokinetics 101. This is our first of 12 monthly webinars explaining how to use an isokinetic machine in the clinic and in the training room. Please welcome our content providers and live presenters, John Hisamoto and Daniel Bodkin. And now for our show. John?
Thanks, Rob. I'm glad you didn't write that down. You just kind of flew off the handle with that. That's very nice. So guys, what we want to do tonight is pretty simple. We want to give you an opportunity to understand the background of isokinetics from a testing and training standpoint. So in order to do that, what we have to do is go back and look a little bit at the history and some of the myths and realities associated with isokinetic training, and also talk about some of the concepts regarding the science behind the exercise, because I think that becomes really important to us. So I'm going to ask Rob and Daniel to mute their microphones right now, and we're going to kind of get this all started a little bit. So any questions that you guys have at the very end, we want to be able to answer some of those and make sure that we can move. But again, today, it's really about isokinetics, the history of isokinetics, and the myth and reality that's going behind it. We're going to talk about the science behind the exercise and rehab concepts. And in the future, next month, you're going to get to hear from Daniel Bodkin. And Daniel is probably one of the top young minds when it comes to isokinetics in today's world. He's been training pretty extensively with it for the last seven, 8 years. He does a lot of training both nationally and internationally for different groups. And some of the interesting concepts that he has kind of brought to the table, he'll be sharing with you. My history with isokinetics goes all the way back to when I was at school at the University of Maryland at Baltimore. I used Cybex actually for our first research project, and I was lucky enough to be recruited by Union Memorial Hospital that had a very aggressive sports medicine department, and we were able to utilize isokinetics pretty extensively for the entire time I was there. But we want to get into all of these different concepts and what it really means to us. But before we do that, this is what's really important. This isn't a sales meeting. It's not anything along those lines. It's about the education and the aspects. And one of the things that really, truly bothers me is that people don't truly understand what's going on with this as a tool. So what we want to do is kind of mention all of the different modes and components that we can use. And one of the things I'm familiar with is if your only tool is a hammer, you have a tendency to treat everything as a nail. What's the most effective tool that you can have? One that's going to allow you to go across the entire concept of rehabilitation, to work on mobility, stability, strength, control. Can you do neuro patients with this? Of course you can. Can you do early ACLs? Yes. You know, can we do some of the other types of activities? Can we do total knees, total hips, total shoulders? Of course we can. And again, the tools become important to us. Now, I hate to tell you this, but I'm a horrible home handyman. My wife pretty much knows that. Don't ask me to do any of the work around the house because literally the only tools I do have are hammers. I've got a bunch of different size hammers and I love to just pound on stuff. But here's the concept that I thought was so interesting, and I want to bring this back. Because right now I am a private practice therapist. I've owned a practice for the last 25 years. And one of the things that I know is that I have to be not only contemporary, but even a little bit ahead of the curve. And so I look for ways that are going to give me advantages. And so I had a neighbor who was having a roof done, same time I was having a roof done. And I watched these guys kind of come in, and my guy kind of used the latest technology. He rolled up pretty quickly. He took the old roof off, laid down the substrate of the shingles. Then he brought in a conveyor belt that just literally lifted all the shingles up into different positions. And the guy came by with a power hammer, and he just started putting the shingles down very quickly. And they were done with my roof in a day. What I found interesting is my neighbor used a different company, and they used a lot of manual labor. So what happened is that, you know, they took everything off by hand. I even saw them out there with hammers, just actually, you know, pounding in some of the different shingles and doing things. Where my roof took a day, their roof took 3 days. the kind of finish. Now, we got to talking, and we know we spent about the same amount of money. What was interesting, though, is I kind of said to myself, do I want to spend, or do I want, as a business owner, to spend 3 days doing what I could do in 1 day, if I had the technology and the equipment and the tools readily available? And the answer is obviously no. I want to make sure that we can do things very effectively and be able to go forward. So that's what today is really all about, is our ability to kind of go forward. So how many tools do you guys use? Now, I have to tell you, I love all the different tools. I use elastic resistance. I'm going to give a big shout out to my friend Phil Page from Performance Health. Phil kind of helps us with some of the videos that we're going to be working through. But here's the point that we talk about. How many of you probably use TheraBand elastic resistance in your clinic? And I would probably tell you most of you. Now, in all reality, how many of you ever learned the science behind the exercise? And that's probably one of the most important aspects. Is there a great science? And interesting enough, there's a ton of evidence-based research behind elastic resistance. I love it. I use it on a daily basis. I think it's extremely effective for a lot of things that we're going to be doing. How about gym programs? Well, we know we need to get into the gym programs and do everything that we basically can do. You know, CrossFit, all the different programs are very effective for our patients to be able to train. And I love how everyone wants to get involved in the gym program. Now, we know most gym programs kind of concentrate around a weight or more isotonic type of information. And we're going to have an opportunity to kind of evaluate that in the future. And I love home exercise programs too. I think that's one of the best things that we can get into. I think it's extremely important in today's world that all of us have home exercise programs readily available to us and that we can offer to our patients. Because in today's world, with decreasing reimbursements, reduction of services, number of referrals that we're getting, being able to develop a most comprehensive program is one of the best things that we can do. And that's what we want to be able to share with you, how we're able to use this in a very comprehensive program. So let's really talk about some early science behind the exercise. And that's the history of what we're going on with. So Isokinetic Exercise was really first developed more than 50 years ago. And a lot of the credit is really given to Helen Hyssop and James Perrin for its introduction. And they had an early paper called the Isokinetic Concepts of Exercise. And they described in it all of the early physical parameters that can be analyzed, including force, work, power, and endurance. And quite honestly, those parameters still mark some of the most important components that we can test for. And even though there's been a huge amount of new concepts for analysis that's been proposed, you know, really looking at force, work, power are very important considerations in today's world. The isokinetic concept is significantly different than isometrics or isotonics. What we're really talking about is the ability to perform constant speed, variable resistance, or accommodating resistance through the range of motion. What they wanted to be able to do is measure peak capacity at every single point in the range of motion. So they wanted to look at force production very effectively. Now, as we go through and as we see some of the things that have happened in the past, we come to realize that some things that we were told may not be appropriate in today's world. So the early, the 70s and the 80s kind of set the stage for a lot of things that we do today. I remember coming out of school and, you know, the Isokinetic gurus at the time really talked about high-speed velocity spectrum training. We were doing really only concentric reciprocal contractions, and most of the research developed during that time were really on these concentric and concentric. During the 90s, kind of Isokinetic exercise kind of gave way to close kinetic. And there's some interesting reasons behind that that we're going to explore in some of these future webinars. But here's an interesting aspect. One of the questions I used to hear all the time is that isokinetic exercise wasn't functional. Now, if we're really doing a lot of concentric reciprocal contractions, I'd probably tell you that that's probably true. But if we're really doing exercise associated with what the patient specifically needs, we can develop phenomenal outcomes on all of our machines. So a lot of the original isokinetic testing and training occurred on dynamometers that only really controlled the upper limits of speed in the concentric mode of contraction. And they were typically referred to as passive machines. So testing and training were normally associated with concentric reciprocal contractions, meaning you train the agonist, the antagonist groups concentrically only. But as we started to develop, and as computers started to adapt from the thermal printers that they had, we were able to kind of record some of this information a little bit more aggressively. And then in the mid 80s, we were able to develop a little more sophistication with the machines, looking at hydraulics and electroserver motors that were controlled by microprocessors. And they were able to offer us better control of all the parameters of the exercises, both concentrically and eccentrically, allowing really for active resistance, but also provide for passive range of motion if we needed to. So again, most of the research on isokinetics was really performed on passive machines, only measuring the concentric mode of contraction. If we really look at latest research or evidence-based research, a lot of it's coming out of Europe and even China, because they're looking at different components than what we have looked at in the past, and rightly so. What we should be looking at is look at the mechanism of injury and the mode of contraction that the mechanism of the injury occurred in, so we can determine that a high majority of injuries occur in the eccentric mode of the contraction. So it becomes important for us to measure both the concentric and eccentric mechanisms. And so our testing has to adapt to be able to look at the eccentric mode of contraction appropriately. Now, like anything else, researchers kind of led the way. The secondary focus was on rehab, and we've been able to do quite a bit in our clinics over the last year with a lot of our orthopedic physicians, because they're interested in knowing what the force capacity is of the quadriceps, the hamstrings, prior to letting someone go into a return to sports activity. Now, I'm going to tell you that's one parameter that we look at. It's not the only parameter. We shouldn't look at just force capacities in order to determine that someone's ready to return to sports. There's other things that we need to pay attention to, but it's an important one, because here's why. One of the things I get concerned with is when I see people testing people for a single leg stance or single leg jump that haven't really understood if they have a quadricep deficit. And so putting them underneath that high level of resistance could be a little challenging for that patient. So where are we getting to in today's world? Well, we're able to do passive isometric, isokinetic, isotonic exercises. We're able to train in both the concentric, eccentric, and isometric modes of contraction. We're able to add EMG. We're able to add different kind of components. And as our future kind of continues, we'll be able to look at a lot of the software to give us these protocols that measure torque, position, muscle activation, and be able to generate that in not only in research, but in return to play. And the future is kind of actually bright when we really talk about what we're able to do. What I'm especially interested in is some of the Europeans are looking at being able to use force velocity training techniques and enhancing a lot of their players to be able to go back. So in the 2000s, I really advocated a return to functional testing and training programs in ways that we were utilizing the machine and the modes of exercise to perform those correctly. We got into more progressive sports-specific training techniques, and we'll talk about eccentric training and high-speed deceleration and some of the things that we need to look at in the future. But pay attention to what's coming, because there will be some exciting avenues on the horizon for things that we want to get into. Now, I think evidence-based research is one of the most important things that we can, as therapists, be able to utilize. And so I want to throw some things in, and I want to make sure that you have access to a lot of the references that Daniel and I go through over the course of this next year with these 12 webinars. So in 2014, we had Current Concepts, Injury Prevention in Athletes After ACL Rehab with Tim Hewitt, who supports the use of isokinetics in return to sports. Most of us know of Lynn Snyder-Macker at University of Delaware. And again, she did a cohort study with Delaware and Oslo looking at more symmetrical quadricep strength. And if you look at Trent Nestler's information, he really looks at symmetry of ACLs and how important that is for us. And then again, in 2017, and we've got quite a few, while open kinetic and closed kinetic may be beneficial, there's insufficient evidence that suggests one is superior to the other. Well, what is interesting is that it's how we teach that exercise that makes it superior. And we're going to have an opportunity to kind of look at that. And that's when we really start talking about the myths associated in physical therapy. And I remember an article that I read by Dr. Susan Harris, who's a PhD PT out of the University of British Columbia. And it was several years ago, but it was a very personal article because she challenges the myths in physical therapy, and one that was very personal to her. So one of the pictures you see is the Pink Ladies Dragon Boat from Tampa. Actually, I have several friends who are associated with this. And Dr. Harris actually had breast cancer. And as a researcher, it was the first time in her life she actually had to undergo physical therapy. And she was given certain exercises by a therapist and told what she could and couldn't do. And I remember reading in her article how she went to visit family. She had a beautiful fall day. They were out raking leaves. She was enjoying herself. She was thinking that, you know, I'm kind of past some of these issues and problems, only to go back and tell her therapist what she was doing. And she got very concerned and very upset because basically she said you can't do repetitive activities with breast cancer because that's going to lead to lymphedema. Well, we also know that a lot of things were challenged back in the 80s. Actually, an American surgeon by the name of Bernard Fisher was one of the first to kind of challenge that radical mastectomies were the only viable treatment. And he kind of went into looking at large randomized controlled studies that maybe we could do partial mastectomies, lumpectomies, combined with radiation, and that could be as effective as a radical mastectomy. Well, what's interesting is that 2 years later, Dr. Harris actually joined a Dragon Boat team, 24 middle-aged ladies who all had been treated for breast cancer, who underwent the challenge of actually performing high-level intense exercise associated with breast cancer. And now we find dragon boats throughout the country. And it's one of the most incredible feats that I think that we see. So we want to challenge some of those myths. We want to come back and say, you know, what is that? Webster always says that a myth is an ill-founded belief held uncritically, especially by an interested group. So a lot of times, if we recall some of our statistics courses, a measurement that is not reliable cannot be valid. So we want to make sure that anything that we're testing and training is valid and reliable. And there are a lot of myths still left in our physical therapy community regarding measurements and what we should be doing. So here's some things that I'm going to mention that we're going to come back to as we go into our progressions of webinars. Are two-speed tests necessary? I used to hear all the time, you want to do 60 and 120. And what about those speeds? You know, are 60 and 180 actually appropriate speeds, and why? I heard as a young therapist that if I wanted to train my athlete to develop fast twitch fibers, I needed to move at fast speeds. And was that actually true or not true? And then again, there was the whole concept regarding open versus closed kinetic chain. And I really want to kind of mention that as we go on. And I want to look at what science has to say, because I think it becomes important for us to look at that evidence-based research. So I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not a big fan of concentric reciprocal contractions. If you're going to tell me, this is what I should be doing, I'm going to tell you you're right. It's not real functional. It could be a little more difficult. And especially if we're going at fast speeds, we might have some shear stress to the patella. We might have some difficulties associated with that. And I want to make sure that we're adapting this to every single patient that we're seeing appropriately. So as a young therapist, this is what I was told to do. You want to go as hard and as fast as you can through each one of these exercises. So they're going to kick out and pull back. Well, you and I both know that we don't do the same thing with every single patient that comes in. Patellofemoral, a infrapatellar tendonitis, an ACL, a quadricep tendon, are all different types of patients. And we may have to adapt to those individual needs. So doing the same exercise isn't really going to be appropriate. So then the question is, what can you do with this? And that's what I hope to be able to answer really in the next 12 months. So look at multiple joints. It's not just for knees. We do a ton of shoulders. We look at hips, we look at elbows, we look at wrists, we look at ankles. We have multiple modes of exercise within this. So in the early phases, if someone has a little stiffness, we can get into passive modes. And then we can follow that with stability isometrically. We can look at submaximal strengthening in an isokinetic mode in a slow component. And then look at isotonics for functional type of training. We can look at multiple modes for testing also. And then we can get into some of our advanced concepts that we kind of bring in. So I kind of know, because I have some friends who are excellent mechanics, they kind of have the best tools. Don't ever ask them to borrow their tools, because they'll never let you. But in order to be the best body mechanic, we should have some of those abilities and tools. And education and what we're going to be doing with it is one of the biggest ones. So here's my point. And the picture on the left really kind of describes an ACL. Anyone can follow a protocol. An ACL protocol actually is pretty easy in today's world. It's not as challenging as it might have been at one point. But how do you treat dysfunction? How do you treat that runner on the right-hand side who comes to you and says, he's training for a 15-mile race, and at 7 miles into the run, he starts to develop lateral knee pain? Do you look at the entire kinetic chain? Do you look at, what dysfunction that they might be having? So how do you treat dysfunction? So here's an interesting concept. This is the U.S. Marine Corps instructing the Iraqi army on simple calisthenics before some training. Now, look at these guys. Look at this guy in particular. Is that a jumping jack? What's he doing at this point? So these are neurologically intact, full range of motion, normal strength individuals who are really having some dysfunction when it really comes down to exercise. So the other aspect behind that is that our assessment is truly critical from a physical therapy standpoint. Now, I hate to say this, I live in Florida, so this doesn't really apply to me, but to all my friends who are up north right now through the Midwest, God bless you, because I'm sure it's tough. And we have to go out and we have to clean those cars, and we have to make sure everything is appropriate. And once we clean it, we recognize that it's not even ours. But how many times does that actually happen to us as therapists? How many times do we think we have the correct assessment only to find out that we don't? So we need to assess the patient as well as we can, looking for dysfunctions, and recognize, do we have a stability or mobility problem that we want to emphasize? Do we need to look at strength, stability, motor control? Do we need to emphasize joint, soft tissue mobility? How do we get around that? And again, we're going to use a lot of our tools. I use hawk grips. I use a lot of different things in order to get mobility, but I use my machine also as a very effective tool. So what is rehab? Because that's an important concept for us to talk about. And I was very lucky early on in my career to have an opportunity to kind of teach with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Fred Ullman, who was one of the original sports medicine orthopedists. And he said something to me that I thought was really interesting. He said, rehabilitation of the athlete deals primarily with the restoration of muscle function, i.e. the missing quality a muscle function must be identified and restored. And so when I started looking at that, I started realizing that a lot of my patients have these missing qualities. They have weak links. And if we're not finding those weak links, we're having issues. So in my early phase as a therapist, we used to do some concentric reciprocal testing. And I remember specifically, I had a professional tennis player, and we tested him, and his quads seemed to test out well. So he went out back onto the court. He would lunge for the ball and hit it. He'd tell me he'd have knee pain. So he would come back in, and we would test him again, concentric. And then he would go back out, and we'd say, everything looks fine. Let's go back out. Let's do this again. And so he came back, and he told us that every time he lunged for the ball, he felt his quadricep, his knee felt like it wanted to give way. So finally, we identified that every time he did an eccentric motor contraction, he had an issue. So we found a machine that allowed us to actually look at eccentrics in the early 80s. And we found that he had a significant eccentric deficit, but not a concentric deficit. And we're going to explore a lot of those different issues that we see. So my first point is to get into really one of the first concepts that we're going to be moving into. And that is understanding that mechanism of injury, but really the motor contraction that the mechanism of injury occurred in. So if we talked about multiple injuries, and if I said to you lateral ankle sprains, what muscles, we know the ligaments, we know the anterior talofibular ligament, what muscles are we really looking at? We're looking at the peroneals, we're looking at the longus and the brevis, maybe the anterior tib a little bit. But what motor contraction was that mechanism of injury occurring? So here's what's interesting. When I talk to a lot of students and I ask them what they've kind of been trained in, while they had an eccentric mode of contraction that was the mechanism of injury, they were kind of trained to do concentric type of contractions. How about rotator cuff tears? How about hamstring strains? Hamstrings are probably one of the things that we see very aggressively that we know occur in the eccentric mode of injury. How about knee injuries? I'll challenge you a lot that non-contact ACLs have a quadricep component. We know patella, infrapatellar tendonitis, jumper's knee, is an eccentric loading problem. How about lateral epicondylitis, medial epicondylitis, and Achilles tendonitis? Anything with tendonitis typically has an eccentric deficit associated with it. So really what a contraction is, and Comey, who's a physiologist out of Belgium, really says contraction is a state of muscle when tension is generated across a number of actin and myosin filaments. So a concentric contraction is when the net muscle movement is in the same direction as the change in joint angle and the muscle shortens. The other way that we can do a contraction is isometrically. That's when neither muscle length nor joint angle changes. Or we can do an eccentric mode. It's when the net muscle movement is in the opposite direction to the change in joint angle and the muscle is lengthened. So the easiest thing that I ask a lot of my knee patients is, do you have problems going upstairs or problems going downstairs? Upstairs, you know that they're utilizing that concentric motor contraction. Downstairs, they're in an eccentric mode. Interesting enough, most of our patients have difficulty descending stairs in that eccentric mode. The other thing for us to really pay attention to is that literature doesn't always just tell us the type of contraction. Sometimes what literature does is it really talks about the function that we're going through. So with a concentric contraction, the function is more acceleration, and the muscle action is more like a motor. If you want to accelerate, you want the concentric contraction. Isometric is more functional from a stabilization standpoint. Muscle is going to act as a stabilizer. And eccentrics, again, the function is deceleration. And the muscle action is really to kind of be like a brake or a shock absorber. So what happens when you develop somebody with a really strong motor, but extremely weak brakes? Most of the time, they're going to crash and burn. They're going to have a problem that we're going to be able to pick it up. So one of the isokinetic pearls that we should leave you with is that most injuries do occur in the eccentric motor contraction. And it's really up to us to kind of pay attention to that aspect. So how about hamstring injuries? I was asked to go down to Peru a few years ago because the Peruvian national team was having just significant problems with hamstring injuries with their football team. Now, obviously, when I say football, I really mean soccer from the United States standpoint. It's really football every place else in the world. But it was interesting because one of the things that they were often talking about is they wanted to put somebody into like an altered or an altered gravity position for running. So my question to you is, do hamstring strains actually occur during impact, or do they occur during the deceleration phase associated with the acceleration of the quadricep when the hip is in flexion and the knee is in extension? So it's important for us to recognize that mechanism of injury and the mode of contraction that mechanism of injury occurs in, so that we can design a rehabilitation program that's going to be effective. So just a few months ago, Buckthorpe in the British Journal of Sports Medicine really talked about recommendation for hamstring prevention in elite football, against soccer. And the title was Translating Research into Practice. And he gave us several little concepts for us to kind of pay attention to. But number one, hands down, was strengthening the hamstring muscles. And he said that injuries occur when forces in excess of the mechanical limits of the tissue cause mechanical disruption. And he further went on to say that eccentric hamstring strengthening training is the most researched and recommended evidence-based strategy for hamstring injury prevention. It's been shown to significantly reduce the risk of primary and secondary hamstrings. Now, a lot of us do eccentric loading hamstring exercises in a variety of different ways. If you do RDLs, if you do Nordic hamstrings, if you do mechanical work associated with eccentrics, it's important for us to be able to train that way. But are you testing to determine whether or not they have the symmetry and the strength to be able to return back to function at a high level of activity? So across the spectrum, when we really kind of look at this, we see this especially, and this information really goes back to Job, back in the early 80s. It's the very first research project that he ever looked at EMG analysis of the rotator cuff in throwing and pitching, and he looked at summary of muscle activity during the stages. So during the windup, the rotator cuff is actually pretty quiet. We go through the early and late cocking stage and then acceleration, but we see during the follow-through is when we have the greatest amount of activation of the posterior rotator cuff. And what in particular are we talking about? What mode of contraction does that mechanism of the injury that we see with baseball players occur in? So it becomes important for us to kind of pay attention to all of those aspects and what we as therapists need to know. So again, going back to some of our muscle physiology, understanding that eccentric contractions, concentric contractions are not the same thing. They don't respond the same. You can't train somebody concentrically and expect them to do well eccentrically. Concentric loading requires activation of the myofibrils with the contractile components, while the eccentric contraction really utilizes the contractile components with passive resistance of the elastic series elastic components and the parallel elastic components. So that allows for differing abilities for tension development. So we know that concentric, eccentric contractions aren't the same. Metabolically, they don't work the same. They demonstrate 2 to 3 times less EMG activity. They're more efficient. They require less oxygen compared to concentric, but they do result in greater amounts of reported delayed onset muscular soreness. You probably remember a few years ago, there was an exercise gym that was very popular primarily for women called Curves. And one of the reasons that they advertised their popularity is they said, well, exercise you without the muscle soreness, because most of their machines were actually designed to do concentric reciprocal exercise, and they weren't doing eccentric loading types of exercises. But again, here's our problem. How many of our injuries actually occur in the eccentric mode? So again, neuromuscular control for eccentric contractions vary from that of concentric contractions. And we'll especially talk about this when we get into some of our neural adaptations that occur. So the second concept, and this is a broad concept that we're going to really expand on in the future, when we get into isokinetics especially, is talking about speed. So velocity of movement, and how do we determine speeds that for isokinetic exercise training and testing that are appropriate across the board. So one of the first things that we should look at is what's called a force velocity curve. And it's a well-researched, evidence-based information. And what it basically says is that the maximum force a muscle can generate decrease concentrically or increases eccentrically as a function of the increasing or decreasing velocities, respectively. Now, I have to honestly tell you, the first time I heard this, and I had one of my early mentors, Dr. Bill Stauber from West Virginia University, and I was one of those guys that he had to sit down and probably explain this to me very, very well. Because I kept hearing, I wanted to do high-speed velocity spectrum training, concentric, and most motions. And what he was trying to explain to me is that the faster I go concentrically, the less force I develop. But inversely, in an eccentric mode of contraction, the faster I go, the more force I develop. It's during the lengthening aspect. Now, isometric is somewhere in between. The concentric, you can generate less force than a maximum isometric, but in eccentric loading, we're able to actually generate more force production than we do in a maximum isometric. So speed or velocity of contraction is one of the factors responsible for tension development. And the reason tension is so important for us is tension is the signal for hypertrophy to take place. If we want a bigger, stronger muscle, we need to develop higher levels of tension. If we're looking for something that's going to be more endurance aspect, we don't have to develop high levels. So again, force is a great physics problem. Force equals mass times acceleration. Okay? And again, acceleration when we talk concentric, deceleration when we talk eccentric. But when we talk force, in most of our exercise, what's the variable that we typically move in a gym? It's going to be mass. It's going to be that weight. We start them on a 10-pound weight, we go to 15, we go to 20, we go to 30, we go to 40. We try to get them to increase that in the gym program. But from a functional standpoint, what variable typically increases force that may cause an injury? Is it mass, or is it that acceleration and or deceleration that we have to go through? And it's probably that faster speed deceleration that increases force considerably. So we need to look at eccentric contractions when we consider deceleration. And so this is the point that I think we really need to spend a lot of time on. And when I go into passive and isokinetic exercises in the future, I want to spend a lot of time analyzing what speeds of exercise are appropriate. So this is what we were told early on. 60 degrees per second was good for slow speeds. 180 degrees per second were good for fast speeds. Now, what kind of determines a fast or slow speed? Because if we talk about speed, it's a scalar quantity from a physics standpoint. It doesn't really have a direction. We kind of look at it in miles per hour, degrees per second. So we know we're kind of moving through this aspect. But how do we determine if something is actually a slow speed or a fast speed? And we're going to look at literature, and we're going to look at science, and we're going to give you descriptions on how we can pick speeds of exercise that will be appropriate for our patients throughout the entire level of rehabilitation. I am not going to tell you that high-speed exercise are appropriate for everyone. In fact, what I'm going to tell you is that most of our patients start with slow to moderate speeds, and only our higher-end rehabilitation patients go on to fast-speed deceleration training techniques that we're going to get into. So we're going to go into this subject very aggressively in the future. But the other concept for us to go after is muscle strengthening. And there's a lot of components for us to kind of pay attention to. There's the biology behind it. There's the motor neuron. There's the overload principle that we've already kind of mentioned. And when we talk about that, we know that we have type 1 or slow twitch fibers, and we know we have type 2 or fast twitch fibers. And again, our slow twitch fibers have fewer fibers per motor unit. They fire at lower or slower force velocity. They have lower force production. As we go into fast twitch, we go into higher force production. They're used for brief, intense activities, and they are very much fatigue prone, where our slow twitch or fatigue resistant exercises. So here's the key that we have to pay attention to. Type 1 fibers has less fibers per motor unit, and they're used at lower force generations. Type 2A, Type 2AB, and Type 2B have more fibers per motor unit, and they're used at higher force requirements. But exercise physiology tells us that recruitment of motor units always occurs from Type 1 to Type 2A to Type 2AB to Type 2B as force increases. So if we go back and look at that force velocity curve and we talk about high speed concentric contractions, how much force are we actually generating? Not actually a lot. So we're recruiting our slow twitch fibers and maybe our fast twitch A. Interesting enough, we could do multiple sets and people got fatigued, but they didn't get really the late onset muscular soreness associated with it because we didn't activate them eccentrically. Now, what happens with force velocity curve? As we increase our speeds, our forces increase. As we increase our speeds faster, we recruit our Type 2A, our AB, and our B as our forces increase, which leads to higher tension development that increases hypertrophy. So strengthening is a result of cellular hypertrophy. It really does occur within that 6 to 8 weeks after beginning training, and it's very specific to the type of work required of the muscle. You know, what are we trying to train? Who are we trying to get back to? And that, again, leads me back to, in our rehabilitation programs, our patients have to be treated individually with each one of these exercises. I'm not going to give you a protocol to be able to treat everyone across the board. I want to give you concepts that will allow you to treat patients very appropriately. So let's take a look at two runners that we have. On the left side, Barkley from the New York Giants, one of the best probably running backs that we've seen in quite a while. They talk about the size of his quads. He did a photo shoot for ESPN The Body, and you can actually see just the size of his quadriceps. What's he weighing at? 240 or so. And then on the right-hand side, we have a marathoner. So what happens to a running back? 240, 250 pounds, running at very fast speeds, loads 3 to 5 times his body weight. 5 times his body weight, general math is going to be, he needs to load between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds. As he moves through that range of motion, he's going to be increasing that deceleration capacity. So he's going to be recruiting at a much higher level. He's activating what we call a stretch shortening cycle. We'll talk about it in just a moment. And he's actually going to be able to generate more force even concentrically to accelerate faster. As he accelerates, he needs to be able to decelerate. So he's going specifically to recruit Type 1, slow twitch, Type 2A, A, B, and B, and he's going to get a very large quadricep. But how about our marathon runner? About 130 pounds, running also 3 to 5 times body weight. So we're talking 350 to 500, 600 pounds, going at a slower pace, at a longer distance. Specifically, they're going to train their muscles to adapt. And that's what we have to do with our patients. We need to look at a continuum. Are we looking for single maximal contractions, such as what somebody in a weightlifting competition, or are we having to do repetitive submaximal contractions with our patients? I don't want to take a postal worker who has to walk 6 miles and climb 300 stairs and train them the same way as my offensive linemen get trained. It's not appropriate for either one. I want to make sure that we're specific on everything that we're going to be doing. And that's why one of the largest principles that I advocate is called the SAID principle, specific adaptations to imposed demands. And what it basically says is the training program must match the demands of the activities. So when we overload, we need to look at resistance, repetitions, rate of loading, and the duration or our time on tension that we're going to be training our patients through. And then finally, when we talk about our last concept, and we'll get into this even more aggressively as we investigate all the different modes of exercise, and I know Danny will talk on this also in the future, is neural adaptations, because I think that this is one of the areas that we sometimes, especially if we're orthopedic sports medicine therapists, have a tendency to kind of overlook. And what neural adaptation is to me is the ability to be able to generate strength in the early aspect of training. Now, one of the things that you probably notice is that muscle hypertrophy takes a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks to occur. But if we take somebody through a training program, they actually start to get a little stronger, faster into the components. So one of the things that we talk about with that is that there's a neural adaptation that actually occurs that just allows that to be able to develop a little bit greater strength in the early aspects. So what do we do with that? Well, we can increase activation of prime movers in a specific movement. We can actually cause some appropriate changes in activation of the synergists and antagonists. You know, we have evidence of neural adaptation anytime that you do any type of cross training, because you get a cross training effect. So we strengthen the right leg in order to help the left leg understand what we're going to be able to do. And we see some of the most rapid increase in strength occurring within the first 3 weeks of training, when we know that biological adaptation isn't happening. So again, Dr. Stauber kind of came back and really said that neural considerations allow us to control the muscle to a greater extent. And we really need to use some of these principles in rehabilitation that support motor control. So the set principle really allows us to adapt to the individual, whatever type of performance they're going back to. And it's one of the largest points actually made against isokinetic exercise. Is it functional? So anytime we apply all of these principles in muscle rehabilitation, we can create very effective training and testing programs across the board. And again, we have to train in the phase that we want adaptation to occur. If you take somebody and you do a drop jump, so you stand them on a 30-inch platform, have them jump down and immediately jump back up. So we do a drop jump. Someone who has not been trained will develop an inhibition and they're actually shut down, whereas someone who's had facilitation or training actually increases that ability to perform that. And that's often referred to as the stretch shortening cycle. You know, in orthopedics and sports, we talk about plyometric effect. So the eccentric training facilitates that stretch shortening cycle. Without training eccentrically, they kind of just demonstrate an eccentric inhibition. So what they talk about is that a concentric contraction that was immediately preceded by an eccentric contraction increases the potentiation of that contraction. You actually develop a stronger contraction concentrically. So here's one of my final points for us. Are we teaching exercises correctly? Are we doing the things that we should be doing for each one of these patients? And can we give them another avenue of exercise that might be effective? So we want to make sure that we're teaching those exercises correctly and not establishing everything across the board. So in closing, really what we're going to be talking about is establishing a rehabilitation program in the future. Basically 5 phases, looking at mobility, stability, strength, and control, and then our return to sports. And what modes of exercise and training that we do in each one of these. And again, we're gonna look at isokinetic exercise, how it differs from isotonic exercise, because it is significantly different. But isotonic exercise has some important considerations for us to look at also. So we're coming towards the end, and I wanted to make sure that we had time for questions. But the very last point for me is there can be biological versus neurologic deficits that we pick up with our testing and training methods. So again, a biological deficits reveal weakness in both the concentric and eccentric modes of the contraction. It indicates perhaps the patient's already made some neural adaptations. But a neurologic deficit typically reveals weakness only in one mode of contraction, and typically it's the eccentric mode of contraction. And it becomes very important for us not to allow someone to go back into that training state without looking at each one of these. So again, in the future, we're going to look at different components that we can get into. We call it eccentric unloading. It's ways that we start to develop mobility, to get into stability, to get into strengthening and training techniques. So a couple of our softball girls from USF. And again, thank you very much for attending. I'm going to ask Daniel and Rob to come back in. And if you have questions, Daniel and I will be taking those questions with you at this point. But it's time for you to be the best body mechanic you possibly can be.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John. That was fantastic.
No problem, Daniel.
All right, John, I do have one question for you.
Okay.
Came from David Betts. He wants to know, at what time is it safe to begin eccentric strengthening after an ACL reconstruction?
Well, that's interesting, because when we talk about eccentric strengthening, what are we actually really talking about? So early on, do we want to activate the muscle? So what if I told you that if we put them in a eccentric unloading exercise, we could actually activate the muscles eccentrically under what a non-weighted isometric contraction would be. So it might be appropriate for us to do it fairly early in the rehabilitation program. Now, I may be getting ahead of myself. So if I said isometric and we're just talking about the weight of their limb. So if we had to lift the weight of their limb, and let's say the weight of their limb is 10 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
If I passively lift them up through the range of motion, and we almost talk about this as being a active assistive exercise to a certain degree, what we want them to do is help lower the weight of their limb on the way down. Now, it's a failed eccentric to a certain degree. It's less force than what you might be doing as a isometric. So instead of having to hold their limb at 10 pounds, we're actually asking them to lower it with 2 or 3 pounds. So all we're doing is activating the muscles, perhaps both concentrically and eccentrically, in order to start motor recruitment or muscle activation, but we're not developing aggressive strengthening techniques early on. So when we really talk about, are we doing higher speed eccentric, that's something that we train patients into. And normally I see that, at the 4 to 6 month time frame when we're getting into more aggressive types of eccentric loading exercises.
Absolutely. All right. Question 2. What is the range of eccentric speeds you use versus concentric speeds for, say, a 6 month, an ACL reconstruction that's 6 months out? So your eccentric versus your concentric speeds.
Okay. And that's a great question. And we're going to really get into speeds of exercise a little bit when we get into isokinetics, because I want to get heavy into the science behind it. Because when we talk speed, and this is where it's so difficult when we talk speed, because everybody's used to thinking degrees per second. But what we have to start to think about is speed over range of motion. We have to talk about the distance that we're moving and whether or not that activates as a slow, a medium speed, or a fast speed. If someone is neurologically intact and they're performing well, a simple test that we often utilize for someone who's a normal activated, neurally activated individual is 1 degree per degree range of motion. So if I'm moving through a 60-degree range of motion, I may set it at 60 degrees in the very beginning. And what I'm looking for is for them to be able to generate the appropriate contraction without a deficit. So I'm really looking at the information that we're getting back from a visual biofeedback standpoint to make sure that that patient is activating the exercise correctly. If they're not, I'm going to slow down those speeds so that we activate it neurologically in the correct sequence before we start to build up those levels of force. And never during those aspects am I going to ask them to give me maximum contraction. I'm going to train them up to 25% of their effort and then move them between 25 and 50% and then 50%. And I'll look at what they're generating during that aspect and making sure that they're able to generate force appropriately before we take them to that next step. it should never just be push as hard as you can. We should train them into those avenues. And there's a way of using this machine, interesting enough, that we can actually advocate for that neural adaptation very easily. And that's simply by slowing the speed eccentrically slower than we do concentrically. So if we go up through a 60-degree range of motion at 60 degrees per second concentrically, I may want to bring it down at 30 degrees eccentrically so that they're starting to learn how to develop that force, and we're giving that neurologic aspect a little bit longer time to be able to recruit appropriately.
Okay. All right. Next question. How much time in a given treatment session do you have your patients spend on the machine? Or, how many sets of exercise are they performing in any one session?
And again, that can vary. I have some patients that I spend quite a bit of time on, and I have some that, depending on what sequence that they're in, they might go a little bit quicker because we're doing some things to get fairly aggressive. So let me give you an example. So I recently had a basketball player that had a significant ACL. So they had some restrictions because they had problems with meniscus repairs and other aspects. So we spent a lot of time in the passive mode of exercise, really working range of motion in order to get mobility and be appropriate with that. And then we went into some very gentle isometric stabilization positions at areas that consistent with where they were having pain. So if they were having pain at 30 degrees in the range of motion, I might go at 20 degrees and I might go at 40 degrees, but I would skip that 30-degree range of motion. So I would do isometrics, and then I could slowly close down that angle and be able to allow people to get into it. And we'll share those, again, when we get into some of our case studies in the future.
All right, John, last question. And this is actually from me. All right. Patriots, are they going to pull it off again?
I have to honestly tell you, if this was a Saints-Patriots game, I would be for the Saints. I like Drew Brees. I think he's done some stuff, but I got to tell you, it's like, Tom's got some intangibles out there that I think are going to be kind of interesting. And, we can all talk about that he's the old guy. And it's kind of like you and me, Daniel. I'm old school and you're the new school guy on the block. I take some of my old techniques and I adapt them, and you've taken a lot of these older techniques and newer techniques and made them even more efficient and effective. So, it's old school versus new school to a certain degree. I think that there's room for both of those. And before I get off, here's the one thing I have to kind of tell everybody. As I said in the very beginning, Danny is one of the top young therapists that I've been able to meet and work with for a long period of time. But he is also, by the time you guys hear from him next month, when he does his webinar, he is going to be a new father. So Danny, congratulations.
Thank you. We're on baby watch right now.
That is correct, on the birth of your baby. It's a very exciting time.
I appreciate that. All right, next month, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of transfer from the theory and the history into the practical use. So I already have a ton of videos ready to go of showing ankle, elbow, knee, shoulder, and hip, all the way from, continuous passive motion, isometrics, eccentric and concentric loading, dynamic isotonics, and testing. So it's going to be very heavy in the applications of the uses of isokinetics. Then the upcoming months after that, we're going to take each of those separate applications and break it down into its components, along with research. So definitely stay tuned to what's coming out next.
John and Daniel, thanks for a great webinar listeners. Thanks for chiming in. We'll send you guys an email and invite you for the next webinar. And also you're going to get an email with a survey on your opinion for this webinar. So to everybody, good night. And I can answer your question, Daniel. It's going to be the Patriots. You don't even need to watch. All right. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, guys. We appreciate you attending.
Johnny?